In this lesson, we'll create a line art pattern with a star shape using the radio waves effect. And for this lesson, we'll create this serial plane effect using only After Effects. So in an untitled project inside of After Effects, the first thing that we'll do is come up to the composition menu and come down and choose New Composition. From this dialog box here, we'll come in here and set the width and height to 3000 pixels. Make sure we're on square pixels. Resolution is full. And for the time start code, we'll leave it at 0. And for the duration, we're going to set this to 10 seconds. This is one of those effects, like earlier ones that we've looked at, where the effect is actually an animation. So let's come in here to the duration, and let's set the second to last set of numbers to 10. So this will give us a 10-second timeline. The last two numbers here are the frames. For the background color, I'll leave this black, and then let's choose OK. And so now we have our composition showing up in the project panel. We also have the composition opened in the composition panel, and down in the timeline panel, you'll see that we don't have any layers. Now, this is the first time in this course we're going to be using something called a solid, which is basically a blank layer. It's a way that we can create a blank object inside of After Effects, and then we can apply effects to that blank object. So to do that, let's come up to the layer menu. Let's come down to New and choose Solid. Now you can name your solid anything you want. I'll name mine Waves. By default, this will pick up the composition size. You can also click this button here, Make Comp Size. So it will default to 3000 by 3000. Square pixels, choose OK. Now it doesn't matter what color this is because once we apply the effect, the background color is going to go away. And so now on the timeline panel, we can see that new solid showing up here as well. This is very much like creating a blank layer inside of Photoshop. And I'll also point out that we get a solids folder in the project panel with our solid inside of there. So now let's go to our effects and presets, and let's come down here and search for radio waves. So I'll start typing the word radio. Radio wave shows up here under generate. Let's click and drag and drop this right on top of the solid. As I mentioned before, this is an animated effect. So once we apply this, we won't see anything happening. Let's come down here to the timeline panel. Let's grab the playhead and just drag this out. And once we drag this, you'll see what this effect is doing. It's creating a series of circles that will radiate out from the center point. So I'm going to bring my playhead to about 7 seconds, which I can see here in the bottom of the composition panel. And so now that we can see some circles, let's come over here to the effect controls and change some properties. So for the first few properties, we'll leave these as the defaults: the producer points, the center points, the wave types, and so forth. Let's come down here under wave motion, toggle this open. Inside of here, let's come over to frequency. This controls how many radio waves are generated. So by default, this is 1. But if I click here and drag this up, you can see we can add more and more circles that are showing up on the timeline panel at the 7-second mark. And if I drag this down, we'll see fewer circles. I'm going to come over here and zoom up a little bit so we can see these. I'll come up to about 25%. Next, let's come down here to the expansion. The expansion controls how wide those circles get over time. So the greater the expansion, the faster they can sort of radiate out. So the default is 5, but if I click and drag this up, you'll see that the expansion is getting much larger for that frequency at the 7-second mark on the timeline panel. And again, you can just sort of drag and play around with these settings to get the exact effect that you're after. Down here under velocity, if we drag this up, we can actually change sort of the offset. It kind of looks like the wind is sort of pushing all of these circles in a certain direction. And so with a series of circles and the velocity set, we can also come in here and change the direction and change the direction of the velocity against all of those waves. So this effect can be a lot of fun if you come in and play with the settings. So what we're going to do for this particular example is I want to create a star shape instead of a circle, and I want to rotate this around a little bit so we can use this on the cover of a brochure. So let's come up here to the center of the effect. Let's click on Reset to bring this back to the defaults. I'm going to come over here and set my magnification to fit in window. And then I'll come down and toggle open the polygon group. And let's come in here and change the sides from 64 down to 5. So I'll hit a 5 and hit Tab. And that will change the circles into pentagons on the stage. Then let's come down here and let's activate the star option. And then for the star depth, let's come in here and set this to about 2.9. And then I'll hit Tab. So that's going to give me these star shapes here. Next, let's come down to the frequency. For the frequency, let's come in here and set this to 5. I'm going to hit Tab. Let's set the expansion to 9. And remember, our timeline marker should be at 7 seconds. And now back in the effect controls, for spin, let's come in here and increase the spin. And if I click and drag and increase this, we can see it spins the artwork around as it's being generated. So let's come in here and let's set the spin to 6. And then finally for lifespan, let's come in here and decrease the lifespan. This means that once the waves are generated, they only live for a certain amount of time. This will give us the ability to fade out all of those individual waves. So let's change this from 10 seconds down to 6. I'll click away, and now we'll see that those waves are starting to fade out at 6 seconds. And since we're at the 7-second mark on the timeline, we have 1 second of all of those waves fading out. Now back in the effect controls, I'll scroll down here a little bit. Let's click on the color swatch here. Let's change the color to white. Let's click OK. And then finally, let's come in here and change the fade in time. This is the amount of time it takes for the waves to fade in once they're born in the center. So I'll come in here and change this to 2 seconds. And now we'll see that the beginning of the waves will fade in while the lifespan setting is fading the waves out. Now in my composition panel here, I'll zoom up a little bit just so I can see this effect a little larger. I can pan around. And once I like the way the effect looks, I can come up to the composition menu, come down to Save Frame As, and then choose Photoshop Layers. And this is going to give me a Photoshop file where all of the negative space between the lines will be transparent. Now I used the same technique to create a pattern for the cover of a brochure, which gave us a really interesting texture for the cover photograph.